From the EPR Creation Studio, this is Unconquered with Doc Staples. As always, this podcast brought to you by EPR Creations, bringing you the best of internet marketing and website development for an affordable price. By Luis Marquez of Momentum Realty in Jacksonville, Florida. By Shenandoah Real Estate in the Research Triangle of North Carolina. By Garage Makeovers, the #1 garage remodeling company in South Florida. And by Justin Galloway of Benchmark Mortgage, serving Florida, Tennessee, and Kentucky. All right, well, here we are for another preview, and this time of a preview that, I think most of you know that I'm probably not going to pick Florida State to win this game, so if you want to skip it, that's fine, but I think there's some interesting stuff in this matchup, and maybe the first thing to put on the table is that Florida State has played a much tougher schedule so far this year than Clemson. Now, obviously, Clemson played Georgia, so not comparable in that respect. But in all sorts of other areas, I mean, Clemson's schedule so far has not been great. It played a bad App State team, a bad NC State team, and a bad Stanford team. And they took care of business against all three teams, but interesting to look at some of the numbers. And then when you go through and see sort of what shows up on tape, this is going to be interesting. This is going to be an interesting game, and it's going to say a lot about really Florida State for the rest of the season, especially since Brock Glenn's going to be playing in this game. DJ Uiagalelei going to be out with a finger injury. Now, I don't think if the finger injury hadn't happened, I don't think they would have started Brock Glenn this week. I'm not sure that he wouldn't have played, but I do think they probably would have waited one more week to get to the bye week to make that switch. If they were going to make it, and I think odds are second half of the season, they would probably have made that switch anyway, but basically having to make that switch a game earlier than they probably wanted to make it. But here we are. And again, it's not ideal for Brock Glenn to, make his debut against one of the better teams on your schedule. So now the other thing I want to put on the table before we move on is, again, highlighting the difference between these two teams' schedules so far. Now, Georgia would be an auto loss for both teams. We saw that with Clemson 34-3, auto loss for both teams in this season. Neither team's going to be able to block them. All sorts of other issues. But when you compare the other three matchups, like I said, a bad App State team, a bad NC State team, and a bad Stanford team, Florida State's actually played 5 teams with a pulse. Now, Cal's not very good. Cal is maybe a little better than Stanford. But I'm not sure that the other 4 teams on Florida State's schedule aren't better than all 3 of the teams that Clemson has played so far in App State, NC State, and Stanford. I think that NC State team is they've got some issues. Now, offensively, they're a little better than some of what Florida State's played, but they've got some just general issues. That's not a real strong team. So, yeah, that's interesting. And when you look at, I was actually surprised this week when Brian Fremo released his toughest schedules of the season so far, and Florida State was number 1, which was surprising to me. Now, there are different ways of dividing this up, and the way that he was doing it was how many losses would an average college football team have so far against this schedule? And FSU's number was 3.2. So that still means Florida State is below average. And there are other methods of calculating schedule strength where, how would a top 25 team do? How would, et cetera. So I don't think FSU's played the toughest schedule in the country as a whole, but it does sort of highlight something that a lot of us haven't really fully valued or fully taken into account, is that FSU's sort of opening slate has not set them up for success in a lot of ways. I still think that opener in Ireland was really bad for this team, and that if this team had had a chance to open with an FCS team to kind of get right, or just a bad team to get right and get some things working correctly, get some momentum and all of this, some of the things that we've seen happen probably never happen. And this team probably starts completely differently. But instead, they go to Ireland, they lose there, then they come back and they're jet lagged somewhat for the next game. They lose that one close. and the season, the wheels are coming off already, and there were already some of those problems, some of the things that we talked about, some of the things that I brought up in the last podcast episode in terms of the difficulties of culture after the offseason that Florida State had. And so I do wonder how much that would be different had the opening season schedule been better. And frankly, if I were Florida State, I would really prefer not to be an international game again, even though the fans love it. It's just, I think it's really hard on teams. Look at what happens in the NFL on that stuff. But anyway, so those are some things to think about coming into this one, that FSU has played a much tougher slate than Clemson. And the one team that was actually above average. Clemson has played 3 below average teams and 1 very good team. And against that one very good team, they looked terrible. Against the 3 below average teams, they looked very good. So where do they sit? Whereas Florida State's played 3 teams that are sort of average to good, 1 team that was actually pretty good, and then 1 team that was a little below average. And they've looked below average pretty much in all of those. So it kind of tells you where these teams have been so far. So let's go ahead and take a look at the matchups. And we're going to start with Clemson on defense, just because this is kind of the more interesting side for this game. Now, with Clemson on defense, there are some surprising things here, both in terms of the tape, watching what you see in the actual games, and in terms of the numbers. Clemson's defense is surprisingly not anywhere near as good as they've been in, recent reputation. This is not a Brent Venables Clemson defense. Now, first half against Georgia, they played really well and limited Georgia's offense pretty significantly. But that Georgia offense has been sort of streaky this year as it is. But here's some things to consider for this Clemson defense on the whole. Now, remember, they've played Georgia, App State, NC State, and Stanford. And these numbers are what come out of this. Their defense is 98th in rushing success rate allowed. They're giving up 5.4 yards per carry on the season. Georgia ran for 6.26 yards per carry. App State, 5.52 yards per carry, 27 carries for 149 yards. NC State had 38 carries for 179 yards. That's 4.71 yards per carry and 3 scores. Stanford went 44 carries for 236 yards and 5.36 yards per carry. Clemson has not held a team below 4.7 yards per carry this season. That's a wow stat for me. That's pretty shocking, actually, because Clemson's been so good against the run in recent years that you just kind of presume when you see Clemson on the schedule of, oh, that's going to be a tough team to block. Good luck blocking those guys. They're going to be able to load up against the run, and you're going to have trouble blocking them in the passing game as well. This is not the same Clemson team that we've seen in recent years in terms of defensive line. And the result of that is that in overall success rate, they're 91st in the country. They're giving up 6.0 yards per play on the season. That's worse than Florida State. Florida State's given up 5.6 yards per play. Clemson has given up 6. That's really not good. And beyond that, Clemson's defense is right now the worst in the ACC in giving up 20-plus yard plays. They've given up 20-plus yard plays on just under 9%. So almost 1 in 10 plays against Clemson go for 20-plus yards, at least so far. Wake Forest, by the way, is next on the list, and they're actually 1.1% better than Clemson. Florida State's 12th on that. So FSU's giving up 20-plus yard plays on about 7% of snaps. That's a pretty significant difference. Now, where Clemson has been really good is in 9 turnovers forced. They've had 6 interceptions, 3 fumbles that they've forced that they've then recovered, which is there's more variability on that. And that's meant that they've had an overall havoc rate that's 3rd in the ACC, basically due to those turnovers. But when you look at their pressure rate, and again, this is what goes back to your defensive line, pressure rate is 26.8%, which is that's the 3rd worst in the ACC. And that's despite the fact that they blitz the 3rd most in the ACC. So they blitz 35% of the time and still produce a 26.8% pressure rate. So for perspective, of the teams that Florida State has played so far, SMU has a 37.9% pressure rate compared to a 26.8% pressure rate for Clemson. And SMU blitzes less than 20% of the time. Clemson blitzes 35%. I'm going to say something that's going to surprise some folks. SMU's defensive line is better than Clemson's, from what I've seen. Now, Clemson has a couple studs, but on the whole, in terms of overall quality of play and overall quality of bodies, SMU has a better defensive line with more depth and more quality bodies against the run and the pass than Clemson does. And that's actually startling to me. That is absolutely startling to me. But I think it's true. Cal, by the way, had a 42.1% pressure rate, or has, and a 26% blitz rate. So they blitz a lot less and a much higher pressure rate than Clemson. Boston College, very comparable pressure rate, almost exactly the same pressure rate, despite blitzing 10% less than Clemson does. Georgia Tech, almost identical pressure rate to Clemson, despite blitzing about 7% less. So that's interesting. In terms of what Florida State's facing up front from Clemson, I don't think they have a whole lot more trouble blocking Clemson than they did Georgia Tech, Boston College, or Cal. And I think it's, maybe not as difficult a group to face as SMU. Now, Clemson's backers are really good. It's the best pair of linebackers FSU will have faced. Barrett Carter is elite in my book. Wade Woodaz, their other, is pretty good. And their secondary is really good. Avion Terrell is a star in the making at linebacker. He's the younger brother of A.J. Terrell, who is really good at Clemson as well. But, yeah, I mean, and to put it in perspective, that pressure rate for Clemson of 26.8%, Florida State's pressure rate is 34.6%. And FSU blitzes 12% less than Florida State. So, yeah. So you pair that with giving up 5.4 yards per carry to teams that, are not dominant rushing teams as it is. I mean, obviously Georgia is a whole different entity, but even if you bracket them, they're still giving up over 5 yards a carry. Just look at Stanford. Stanford averaged 3.27 yards per carry against TCU, 3.72 yards per carry against Cal Poly, 5.41 against Syracuse, and then 5.36 against Clemson. Clemson's run defense has not been great. And then you add to that they're not getting a ton of pressure on the quarterback without bringing a lot of blitz. And this makes it pretty interesting in terms of a matchup for Florida State, because Florida State has not been able to run the football against anybody, against air. But they've also played some teams that are actually pretty good up front and have been good at not giving up the running game. I mean, all of them. So you look at the schedule so far, all of those teams have actually been pretty decent against the run. Clemson might be the worst against the run that FSU's faced so far. Actually, I think they are. So that's interesting. And then you have the big question is, how much of a spark can Brock Glenn bring the Florida State offense? And, this is the thing. And I've tried to explain this to people for weeks who keep asking, like, well, why can't they just make the switch? Why can't they make the switch to Brock Glenn? Well, the thing you have to remember is, as a coach, you can't just replace somebody with somebody else who has not earned it. For the culture of your team, that has impact. Now, the tricky part about this, and again, let me be clear, I have said since the halftime of the Georgia Tech game that they need to give Brock Glenn a look, and that, you know, they need to at least give him some opportunities because of what you've looked like with DJU. So that's clear. But again, explaining why they haven't done it, he's not been better than DJU in practice. And yeah, I know we talking about practice, man. But at the same point, if a guy is clearly getting outperformed in practice and then you just make a switch to him, what does that communicate to the rest of your roster? That's part of the problem. But on the flip side, if a guy's not getting it done in games, you've got to take a look at, and you've got to show players that what matters is getting it done there. So you're kind of in a catch-22 situation when a guy who's outperforming the other guys by a good bit in practice doesn't get it done in games. You're kind of, that's a tough spot to be in as a coach. Nevertheless, now the hand has kind of been forced, and now they get to find out, like, can Brock Glenn, despite not being as consistent in practice, despite, you know, putting the ball in danger a little more, despite some of the things being less accurate in practice, all of those things, can he be better for your offense in games? And I think there's a non-zero chance here that that's the case. For one, he moves a whole lot better than DJU, who has moved. I think I'm safe saying that he's not been fully 100% in terms of as a runner. At this point, I think that's now public. And even before that, wasn't really a runner. We talked about that before. I mean, he's more of a between the tackles type option if that's what you have, but you got to be able to block that, and they haven't been able to. So you got a guy that can do some things on the edge in a way that DJU can't, right? Some zone read stuff, some, you know, counter read, getting the quarterback out of the pocket and potentially just making plays on the run. You wonder how much that might jumpstart the offense. Just to put it in perspective, let's say you run some boot stuff and DJ has to make the throw because he's not going to get more than 2 or 3 yards as a runner. What happens if you put the quarterback in there who, if he doesn't like what he sees, just tucks it, runs, and gets 7-8 yards on those plays? That could completely change your offense. So, you know, that's a question about what might happen in this game. I actually think there's reason to think that Brock Glenn can, by just his particular set of skills, his skill set, that he actually can be a better option for this offense just because of what DJ's specific limitations are within this offense. So put it another way, one guy can be a better player, but a worse player in a given offense because of what surrounds him, while another guy is not as good, and definitely not as good in practice, even within that offense, but actually move that offense better and be a better match, a better fit for that offense because of his strengths and weaknesses matching up better with melding better with the strengths and weaknesses of the guys around him. And I think there's a real chance that that's the case with Brock Glenn. Now, I'm not super optimistic that, I'm not projecting that Brock Glenn is going to come in and be a great player. I don't think there's a lot of evidence of that. But really what you need from him is, can he make a few throws down the field? Can he, hit a vertical 2 or 3 times in a game? And can he otherwise just protect the ball and make some plays with his legs and get the team in the right run looks and just make good decisions in the read game and in the RPO game? Can he just manage the game and then make 1 or 2 throws downfield? If he can do that and then make some plays with his legs, he's a plus level player compared to what you've been getting there. So there's a real chance that he could give FSU a spark here. And with him on the field, the question is, can Florida State, against a team that has not been able to stop the run this year, can they find some running game against that team? And by the way, I think in this game, I would be looking pretty strongly at some outside zone and some, zone G down stuff and, some of those sorts of things against this defense, because that's some of the stuff they've struggled against in the games that they've played so far. So, I'm not sure this is a game you want to spend a lot of time, spend a lot of your powder running counter on this team. But I do think that you can threaten this team with the run game. And if you go outside zone and some boot action and things off of that, I think there's plays to be made against this Clemson team that Florida State actually can make. And, with the quarterback read game and finding some running lanes, this game could get really interesting. Suddenly Florida State has life in the run game and can sort of counter off of that and get some RPOs and all that. What happens if that happens? Does all of a sudden the team come back to life and they get some momentum and all of that? I think there's a non-zero chance here. Offensive line has to play better, no doubt. But the bottom line for me is that this Clemson team, this Clemson defense can be blocked. This is not one of those games where you come in and you say, you're not going to be able to block this team, so there's zero chance of winning. I don't think it's that, because I don't think this Clemson team's defensive line is better than the team you just lost to in Dallas. And you were able to create some run lanes in that game until a really bad interception off the face mask of your tight end, who is continually costing you points and, has cost you maybe 2 games so far. And again, you were able to start getting some movement against that defensive line and starting to be able to run the football against that group. And then the game just got out of hand. Can you prevent that from happening in this one and start to get some movement in the run game like you did against that defensive line? I think that's totally possible. So the other thing is, how many tricks does Florida State have up their sleeve in terms of, getting creative offensively to take advantage of some of the spots that are there on this Clemson team against this Clemson defense? There's a lot of really interesting stuff here. It could be an interesting game and maybe a surprising game for a lot of people. Let's move over to the other side of the ball here. So looking at Clemson's offense, well, this one is maybe less of a good matchup for Florida State. So first things first, Clemson has dominated the 3 bad teams that they played so far. App State, NC State, and Stanford. They blasted at App State 66-20, NC State 59-35. And that 35 number, by the way, that kind of tells you something about their defense. Now, they were up 28 after the first quarter, so there was a little bit of a letdown there, so I understand that, but still. And then 40-14 over Stanford. But, they scored on 10 straight drives between App State and NC State. So this offense really got into a rhythm, and that's something that Florida State's offense hasn't done all season. But they really got into a rhythm against the bad teams that they played. Nevertheless, when you watched them against Georgia, that Clemson offense looked as impotent as Florida State has looked at any point this season. So the question is, how good is Clemson's offense really versus a defense that has the athletes to match up against it? That's the question. And to me, the real key to this game on this side of the ball is Clemson running the football. When Clemson has been able to run it at all, they've been really good, almost impossible to stop offensively. They ran it for 7.4 yards per carry. App State, 8.15 yards per carry against NC State, 5 yards per carry against Stanford, and 2.0 yards per carry against Clemson. Or against Georgia. This is Clemson. So 2 yards per play running the ball against Georgia. They just couldn't do anything against Georgia. Now, against App State, NC State, and Stanford, one of the things that they did is they got Cade Klubnik involved as a runner, running quarterback power, quarterback counter, a number of those types of looks, getting him the ball on some designed runs, and he made some big plays in that. And as a scrambler, as a runner, he's also made some plays on the run. And so that, to me, the real danger, if Florida State gets blown out in this game, which is totally possible, I think it starts by giving up problems in the quarterback run game and basically Klubnik hurting Florida State on the scramble and on the run. So scrambling outside the pocket, making a couple big throws down the field, getting some yards with his feet, sort of frustrating you with that, and maybe a big play or two on the quarterback run game. I think that's where if you get blown out in this game, that's where it happens. Because otherwise, Phil Maffa, big back, he's got a lot of power. He's a guy I really like. I actually think he's a better back than what they had as their starter the last few years. I felt like last year he was the better of the two backs that they had. But he also is not a huge, get up and go big play threat. He's averaging 7.95 yards per carry on the season. Pretty much all that damage being done against the three bad teams. And, does run really well between the tackles. And then they've got Jay Haynes, 5.4 yards per carry, and then Klubnik running it well of late as well. Florida State, if I'm FSU, I'm loading up against the run, and I'm trying to do what Georgia did and saying, you're not going to run the quarterback, you're not going to run your running backs, you're going to have to beat us with your outside wide receivers. And yeah, good luck beating the man coverage. Good luck beating our athletes outside, because I'm still not sold on Clemson's receivers. They've got some young talent. Their actual leader in yardage right now is Bryant Wesco, who's a 6'2 freshman, true freshman, who has been interesting to watch. He's going to be really good, really fluid, really fast. And then TJ Moore is another freshman who has flashed a lot of potential there. Another guy that, 6'3", 200, really good looking prospect. But those guys are true freshmen, and they've really not done anything against the better teams. So if you look at Bryant Wesco, Georgia, 1 catch, 5 yards. NC State, 1 catch for -1. And it was, one of those little bump passes in the jet sweep family. And then you have App State, three catches for 130 yards, 1 touchdown, and then 1 that he was down on the 1 yard line on. So two long catches in that one. And then Stanford, 2 catches for 104 yards and 1 touchdown. So a little bit boom and bust there from the true freshman. And he's a guy you have to be aware of because of his ability to just run by you. But he hasn't really done it yet against the better teams on the schedule. Against NC State's secondary and against Georgia's secondary, very quiet. Otherwise, you're looking at Antonio Williams, Cole Turner, Adam Randall, and then tight end Jake Brenningstool, who's really the guy that they come to when they need a conversion. But Antonio Williams is the primary guy. I mean, he's got 16 catches. Brenningstool has 14. Nobody else is in double digits. So, and I think you can cover those guys. I think you can force them to be a little bit more one-dimensional. If you can force them to be one-dimensional, you can cover their pass game. Klubnik against Georgia, 18 of 29, 4.9 yards per attempt and 1 pick. And that's partly because they didn't have receivers running open, and partly because Klubnik does not like pressure. If you can get pressure on him, he changes. If he gets a little pressure, just enough pressure to be able to break the pocket, and he's making throws from outside the pocket, he's very comfortable. But if you can pressure him and compress that pocket, that is a guy that does not like throwing from a compressed pocket. And he will make mistakes in there. He will struggle with some accuracy in there if you can compress that pocket and really make him feel cramped. Does not like it. So, again, there are things that you can do here to cause them problems. And if you look athletically and schematically at the comparisons here, Florida State is closer schematically and athletically to Georgia. Now, do not misunderstand me here. I'm not saying Florida State's defense is like Georgia's or comparable to Georgia's, but they're closer to Georgia's than they are to App State's, Stanford's, and even NC State's. NC State, look at their defensive line this year. They don't have dudes. Florida State at least has the bodies on the roster who, if things click and they get guys to do what they're supposed to do and play well, they can cause problems closer to what Georgia did compared to, say, anything that the other 3 opponents that Clemson has played this year have been able to do. So that, to me, is the interesting thing about this game, is Clemson is by far the better team so far in 2024. I mean, it's not close. Nevertheless, if you look at the matchups on the offensive and defensive lines, I'm not persuaded that Clemson is far and away better than what they're facing in Florida State. And Clemson is kind of depending on that to some degree in how they're set up this year, because they don't have a ton of playmakers on the outside at this point. The guys that might turn into that are still young, and maybe they make that difference, but normally those true freshmen are not going to be guys that are going to do that. Ryan Williams and Jeremiah Smith accepted. So this becomes an interesting matchup. This is a really interesting matchup. So let's go ahead and move then to our final predictions here and assessment of this game. So there's a lot of, especially with the addition of Brock Glenn to this, there's a lot of uncertainty about what to expect from this Florida State team, and how much more effort are you going to get in this one? I mean, are you going to get an inspired effort where they play like they should have been playing all season? Are you going to get a team that's going to go down by a score and start to quit? I have no idea what to expect on all those fronts. Are you going to get a spark from Brock Glenn, or is he going to turn it over 3 or 4 times and then, it turns into a rout? Any one of these options is a possibility in this game. This game has a very wide delta of what to expect. I wouldn't be surprised if after this game, I came in for the Hot Takes podcast and I was talking about a Clemson 48-6 win. Would totally not surprise me. I also would be not all that surprised if I came into the Hot Takes podcast and I was talking about Florida State having pulled an upset 27-24 or 31-30 or something like that. Totally possible also. Now, I'm not betting on this Florida State team, which has not played well. They've not been coordinated well. There's just been so many problems. And, it's been like the, proverbial dam with the leaks where, you plug one and then another one pops up and, you've only got so many fingers. It's been one of those deals. So I don't trust this Florida State team to pick Florida State. But I do think that this is actually a winnable game. It's a game that if things break the right way, you suddenly change the complexion of your season and the feeling of your fan base pretty quickly. Now, of course, if that happens, there's going to be a whole lot of people talking about how big of a mistake it was not to play Brock Glenn sooner. I bet you that Mike Norvell would make that trade and say, you know what, I'll trade everybody, thinking I was completely wrong and maybe even being wrong about this for a win against Clemson here. Guarantee you that he'd take that. But all things being equal, I kind of have to think about what the most likely scenarios are here. I think the most likely scenarios are all Clemson wins. This game gets played 10 times, and I think Clemson wins probably 8 of them. But there are a couple scenarios where that changes. So, I'm going to kind of split the difference on what I expect to happen in this game. I actually do think that you're going to see Florida State show some signs of life offensively and defensively in this game. I think this is going to be a much closer and harder fought game than people expect. The way that changes, if Florida State turns it over 2-3 times, this game gets out of control and Clemson dominates this game. But I think Florida State's going to protect the football a little bit. And I think this is going to be one that's going to go into the fourth quarter. I think FSU is going to find more running game in this game than they've had really since that Georgia Tech game. And they're going to put some pressure on the Clemson offense to match. I just ultimately do not trust Florida State's defense to be able to limit the run game well enough for 4 quarters to come away and beat this Clemson team. So ultimately, I'm going to go with Florida State 27, Clemson 34. And yeah, 27 points. First time over 20 points since the opener. But I'm going to go with Florida State 27, Clemson 34, and give, say, an 80% win probability to Clemson. If Florida State is up in the turnover margin, one or two turnovers, I think they might win this football game. But that's where I'm going to go. Clemson 34, Florida State 27. Talk to y'all again after the game.
If you've been enjoying this podcast, please leave a 5-star rating over at Apple Podcasts and wherever else you listen to podcasts. Post and repost episodes on social media and tell a friend. And if you haven't left a review in a while, do it again. It really does help the visibility of the podcast. Before we go, I'd also like to thank my advertising partners once more. That's EPR Creations, Luis Marquez of Momentum Realty in Jacksonville, Florida, Shenandoah Real Estate in the Research Triangle of North Carolina, Garage Makeovers, the #1 garage remodeling company in South Florida, and Justin Galloway of Benchmark Mortgage, serving Florida, Tennessee, and Kentucky. You can also stop by the Unconquered Shop at unconqueredpodcast.com, where you can buy stickers, pins, magnets, t-shirts, and other swag.
I am especially grateful for those of you at the Dynasty level. That is Brian Leininger, Dave Blair, Jack Horton, Jonathan Kennedy, Lee Caswell, Travis Smith, and Tyler Kashishki. You all are far more generous than I deserve. Thanks to you all.
This has been Unconquered with Doc Staples. I'm your host, Jason Staples. Thanks for listening, and thanks for your support. I made this.
So you're telling me there's a chance? Yeah!